Hi, everybody. Nice to see you.
Good afternoon. Glad you are all here. My name is Bill Harris, and I'm the director here at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. And we really appreciate you coming out today for this conversation with our guest and good friend, Paula Giddings. And we'd also like to welcome everyone who will be watching as we stream this. And just a couple of notes before we get right into it. We will speak, 30, 35 minutes, 10 minutes or so of questions. And then Paula will happily sign some books out in the lobby.
Yes, indeed. Happily.
So without further ado, I'll give just a little brief background for folks, and then we'll get to it.
We'll converse.
Yeah, that's right. Paula is the Elizabeth A. Woodson 1922 Professor Emerita of Africana Studies at Smith, where you were on faculty for many years, right? And she has been an editor and a writer, and still a writer. And she's written several books: In Search of Sisterhood, Delta, Sigma, Theta, and the Challenge of the Black Sorority, When and Where I Enter, The Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America. That's a whole program we should do still. And what we're here to talk about today, Ida, A Sword Among Lions, Ida B. Wells, and the campaign against lynching. I'd just also say that Paula was one of our advisors on our exhibit, Black American Civil Rights in the Roosevelts, and was central to that process, and we very much appreciate that. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you. It's good to be here.
And so we're going to talk about someone that everyone should know more about, because her impact and her legacy. I usually dislike that word legacy. It suggests something that's sort of amorphous and out there.
Yeah.
It's really about impact and what we can learn and trails that are set by people braver probably than I am, certainly. So just to start, Ida B. Wells Barnett, how did you get to her? How did you get to a place where I want to write about this person?
I was writing my first book, When and Where I Enter, which is about Black women and their roles in civil rights movements and in women's movements. And Ida just sort of sat down on the page and she said, look, these women are cool, they're important, but I'm the one, I'm central to this. And I didn't know that sort of sounds maybe a little bit too spiritual, but yesterday I was at Columbia University. They unveiled a bust of Ida B. Wells, the Columbia School of Journalism. So now it's going to be in the hallway. And the sculptor was there. And she they asked her the same question. And I so related to what she was saying. She said, you start with this big block of clay and you start poking at it and you're looking at pictures and you're trying to understand it. Because biography, it's a little different than history, which I had to learn in writing it, by the way. Could you, excuse me, I have allergies. You have to know your subject in a particular way. And so she talked about putting this in her hands and shaping it, and finally things begin to come through to you. And I said, gosh, the writing process was so similar to that. It's a big block of research, and there's so much going on, and you have your facts and figures, but at some point she has to come alive for you. And at some point you have to know, for example, to know what she's going to do even before she does it. You have to understand her in that way. And that's why biographies take such a long time often. And
it's interesting, working in archives, as I have my whole career, when you're around people, in this case, the Roosevelt, in an intimate and behind the scenes way. The way a historian gets involved in ways that just a casual researcher, it's not their topic, you're
exactly.
you're getting to know that
We can
person.
begin to internalize
Yeah.
them in a particular way. And I just felt that she was going to, but before I even intellectualized it, Bill, I just felt she was going to teach me things. And she's just sort of said, take me by the hand. I will show you what this country is about in some ways. And so I did. And she was fascinating to me every day. Never got tired of her. And she was just and she is a central figure that in a formative period of America, and she's forming along with America and talking about it and telling people about it. And then, of course, this courageous activist.
It's a courage I would think many of us would find hard to imagine, considering she's born into slavery in the Deep South in Mississippi. I know exactly. I've spent much time in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and I know it well, and I can't imagine. And so, talk us through that. I think, but how does someone with her background, with sort of, to use your words, who fate or destiny suggests would have one kind of life, and yet she begins to carve out a very entirely different life early. It didn't like come late in life, early in her life.
I think one key is that happens, and this is interesting because this also was true of Eleanor Roosevelt. They're orphaned at an early age.
Interesting, yeah.
And there are actually psychological profiles. There's interesting research of psychoanalysts. There was a psychoanalyst who wanted to look at health problems of national leaders and major leaders and how it impacted them. And what he found was that a corollary was how many of them lost their parents at an early age. And he talked about this thing called creative mourning, in which there's compensation for this loss and this rage by trying to, by first of all using something that is large, like a metaphysical thing, politics, writing, etc., and really trying to change the world in a way that they fit in it better.
Oh, interesting.
And there's a whole list of characteristics of these people. And when I started reading it, just fit Ida Wells to a T. Negative things and positive things. And so I think this is she. But there's something else that happens with her. I'm sure many of you know the story in the biography, a biography of her, not mine, of that she's orphaned. And at the age of 16, both her parents died 24 hours apart in Holly Springs, Mississippi. She has 5 brothers and sisters. Another child dies in the yellow fever epidemic as well. And she, friends of the family meet and decide what to do with the children. And they want to divide them up among them. And Ida Wells says, absolutely not. My parents would turn over graves if we separated. You find me a job teaching, and I'll take care of the. So this I think this angered a number of people. Number one, and this is so transgressive. This is a 16-year-old in the South is going to take care of a family, a single woman, single Black woman, going to take care of this family herself. Well, to make a long story short, in this period, there were doctors and organizations that would come to cities that had pandemics. And they came to Holly Springs. These are white doctors and organizations. And there was a white doctor taking care of her father and mother when they were ill. And on his deathbed, her father gives the doctor his savings to give to Ida for the family, because he knew he was dying. The doctor takes the money, asks to meet Ida, and they meet in the public square. And Ida is seen taking money from this white man in the public square. And immediately rumors begin that she's soliciting, and that the real reason why she wanted to be with her brothers and sisters alone was so she could do this. And what's so interesting about this is, Bill, this rumor about her sexual propriety will follow her for almost all of her life. It comes back to haunt her all the time. And one reason, this is a Victorian period. This is and so I think she understands slander. And later she will help her understand how the race can be slandered.
Because these issues do come up over
the same
and over,
thing in a collective way. She understands why the race needs protection. She understands that the race has been abandoned after Reconstruction, like she's been abandoned. So I think there is this is real armchair psychiatry, but I think there's something to that. That's why I mean she's developing, and the country is developing, and race relations are developing in a corollary way.
Well, I think why sometimes people are uncomfortable with armchair psychology, but really biography in many ways is a lot of armchair psychology, isn't it? Because you're listening to the person as much as you're reading about them. You're trying to hear their voice.
Absolutely.
And so and it just shows how complex people are, and what they're taking and what they're giving back, and where their anger and their empathy and sympathy all mingle right into choices. So she is. But I'm not going to say she could have taken an easier path, because there was no easy path. But she ultimately is taking maybe she didn't feel this way, but any external witness to this would be like, she's taking a harder way. She's choosing a way that's almost guaranteed at that time in that place. One could even say maybe today in certain times, in certain places, that's going to draw attention, and that is risky. And violence is ever present. And she's choosing to do this.
One of the riskiest things she does, even before she starts the anti-lynching campaign, which is pretty risky. But she is able to, which also takes another kind of courage, she is able to defy the kind of Victorian dictates of the time. She's very transgressive about the role of women, about what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do, what they're supposed to talk about and what they're not supposed to talk. This is one of the things that also feeds into the rumors, because as we know, transgressive women, there's always a rumor about their sexual propriety and other things. She is she is willing, but she's as hard on herself as she is on others. I mean, she really calls out people who she feels is not doing what they're supposed to be doing for the race, mainly. But she's hard on herself. She really goes into this self-reform kind of thing, because, and this is in her diary. Thank goodness we had a diary, because that's the only way you could really sort of get her voice. What you realize in her diary, what you see, is that she's just a ball of rage. I think from the abandonment of her, from the sense of abandonment, both by the community and she's so angry it eats at her, and she's determined. You could see it in what she's writing, determined to get a hold of this anger and do something about it. And she says it's my besetting sin. She knows that she has terrible relations with people. She has she's always the outsider. And so she works. And I think part of that energy, because the anger doesn't really disappear, but it turns into a energy of reform. self-reform and societal reform. And so, so this is, and it was interesting to trace that process, process with her. But once that begins, that once she gets on that path, I mean, she says herself, she says, you know, when she's in her activism and anti-lynching, she says, I'm going to follow this through, even if the heavens may fall. And they did.
And I think of Walter White 40 years later, who, well, 30 years later maybe, who's going through the South studying lynching himself and the dangers he faced. And here you're a Black woman,
right,
single, and all that you're right entails. And she is not afraid to take on the big, ugly, you know,
right,
dirty public secret of the South, which is, you know, the ongoing,
yes,
you know, use of rape and then sexuality and then the way in which people define.
You know, everybody, people were calling rape outrages. You know, there were all these metaphors, and she says it's rape.
Yeah. She says that. I mean,
she says it.
And in the Victorian era, that's a shocking thing.
And ladies didn't, you know, the Victorian, of course, this idea of the true womanhood and of the lady who just didn't do certain things. They certainly didn't think about lynching with the ideas of sexuality and corruption and all that. You know, and the difference with Walter White, of course, is that Walter passed as white. So he could go into these Klan meetings and all that. That's a wonderful. That's a wonderful story.
But she addresses those questions herself, even with her own, hence not making friends at times within her own communities, because she was equally fierce with her own folks as she was.
Maybe even more so. She always she didn't believe in this idea, which was of the idea of the period, that it was the elites who are supposed to lead in race relations, both white elites and Black elites engaging each other to deal with race relations. You know, she didn't believe in that, and she really develops grassroots movements, and she develops movements, ideas around civil disobedience, and which goes absolutely against the NAACP's ideology. It goes against. And she has her own ideas of respectability, which is different than most. And so she really is defiant to the major racial organizations and leaders, and they never forgive her.
How does she go from a 17-year-old teacher in a small Southern town supporting a family to where, you know, that's always the mystery. How does someone become who they are, of course? But that initial step from Holly Springs to, how does she make that next step where she's actually writing in the Deep South about things that men wouldn't write about, but certainly women women didn't or wouldn't?
She is invited by an aunt in Memphis, who's also widowed by this same yellow fever epidemic and has 2 children. And she's invited by an aunt to come to Memphis. And Ida is just wondrous, coming from Holly Springs to Memphis, which at this point, in this stage of its development, is called the Chicago of the South. It's humming. It's new industrial. You know, it's the new South now. It's humming with new sort of industries. There's lots of opportunities. Many Blacks are doing very, very well. There are new schools. She is able finally to become a school teacher. But before that, in Memphis, the big thing that happens is she's always involved with political people. She's involved with political people in Memphis. And one of the big issues is segregation of the trains. And this is very, very interesting. The trains were set this way. There was first class, which was for ladies and their gentlemen attendants. There was the colored train, which was supposed to be a first class train, by the way. This was the separate but equal days. And then there was a smoker's car, which had, the ravages of society in it, right? Where there was smoking and cursing, and everybody was together, by the way, white ethnics, blacks, everybody's riding in that last train. And this was becoming a civil rights issue. We'll see that one of the earliest challenges to segregation, separate but equal, is really women, black women, who are insisting upon their integrity as ladies and as women, despite the fact that they're always being pushed. Now, race at this point is still, it's not fixed yet. That doesn't happen until Plessy in 1896. And so sometimes people could ride the first class. They would let them, and sometimes they wouldn't. What got a lot of professional black women could get them very upset is that white women would have their black maids on that first class, but they wouldn't let a professional woman riding herself on the class. So in 1883, there's a lot of happening in Memphis because this is the civil rights laws become turn in 1883. Miscegenation is also made illegal in 1883 at the same time. And these trains become a great issue. Ida is taking a train. As she writes, she looks into the colored car, and there's smoking going on. What happened? The other thing that happened, I hope I'm not going too long.
No.
The other thing that happens is that whites would leave the first class car, men, come to the colored car, smoke and do colored blah, 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 and then would return to the pristine first class car where they were finished. So she saw a white man smoking in the colored car, which was a real marker that it wasn't first class, and she had bought a first class ticket. And she says, I'm not going into that colored car. It's no longer first class. I have a first class ticket. She goes into the first class ladies' car. And the conductor asks her to leave. She refuses. He asks her to leave again. She refuses. He gets help, and they actually lift her up out of the seat. Not before she bites him, though, but it was a big mess. Takes a good chunk out of him, but she has to leave the train. She leads the train, but she takes the train to court. And there's actually a transcript available of this, the actual transcript of the court case, which is just wonderful, handwritten, And by the time Ida went to court, of course, she's a lady again, right? And she always dressed to the nines. So she had a parasol and a hat and gloves. You read this description. So she's a lady, an innocent lady again. And the conductor testifies, and he says, she looks like a lady now, but she bit me and I bled freely. So, but she wins the case in the lower courts.
She wins, which is
wins in the lower
one
courts.
would not expect that.
Exactly.
It's remarkable.
Exactly.
And yet.
And she becomes a hero. She becomes a hero in her town. This is really a long answer. And as a result, newspapers, this is an important period of the Black press, like 200 newspapers are being published every week throughout the country. And a lot and including church newspapers as well. And they ask her to write about her experience. And she starts writing. And at one point she says, it's through journalism I found the real me. She found a way to express all that stuff churning inside of her by writing.
That rage and anger. Anger. It's got an outlet. And an outlet that requires a degree of organization of that rage.
Yes. And that's what she's working very intentionally on that.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it brings to mind too, as you were talking about that, we think of course, Rosa Parks. But here we have and we talked about this earlier, and we certainly do in the exhibit, that the civil rights movement, we think of many people as this 1950s and 60s. Sometimes you get the 40s. American experience.
Right.
When in fact, the civil rights movement has been an ongoing,
Ongoing.
evolving movement.
Absolutely.
And here you have someone who's challenging public accommodation and then begins to write. And if you could speak to, you mentioned the newspapers, but there is an enormous audience who are responding and who are reading, and there are outlets and sources for people to talk about the inequalities and the violence. And it isn't some sort of modern contemporary media notion with television, that it long preceded that in terms of you could mass communicate with people about injustice. And she became a voice
yes,
of that.
There were a number in this period, technological innovations, also in terms of publishing newspapers. And so now newspapers could actually be transmitted nationally. And people would pick up, you can't find the free speech, her newspaper that you will finally own and edit. But you can find papers that pick up her articles and they picked up each other's articles. So they had this ability, but of course there's the same ability to also transmit across the country all the negative stereotypes on the other side. And this is also interesting. It's a period where it's modern social sciences really begin to emerge in this period in the late 19th century, and it's very racialized. And people from the Ivy League professors are talking about Black people who are especially men who are regressing into animal behavior, and therefore prone to rape. What's interesting in this part of it too is that this is when people now a lot of them have read Darwin, who says that there's an animal we have an animal within us. We evolved from animals. So this idea of the animal within is also a part of this period. This is the period when Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is written, right? And so there always is fear of this. And according to a lot of social scientists, the animal has emerged and conquered Black people, right, who are no longer civilized by slavery. There's always the question: what are we going to do with these free Black bodies now? And who are they, and what are they? So this also could be transmitted nationally. So it's quite a.
It is, because there's this cauldron of sort of purposeful reunification of the North and South through the polite literature and the press at the same period, where the sort of romanticism of the South,
That's Victorian, yeah,
is emerging as well, to make everyone feel great.
Yes.
The old South, this sort of romantic idea of the way things were. At the same time, these horribly oppressive Jim Crow laws begin to come into place, which play directly off of, the animal, the wild, needing to control, the Nazis actually based some of their racial laws on those.
Right.
So,
and one of them is say one of the issues of that is that this is also a period, of course, of Northern investment into the South to reconstitute the South after the war, and Northern investors were a little wary of the South because of all of that. And so the South was always trying to prove that it was a new South, that it was different, that they had the discipline and that they wanted racial cooperation so the South could succeed. And one of the things that Ida would do is wanted to say is, no, it's still that old South and it's a mess, But she also understood the economic impact of her campaign on that level.
So how does she get from Michigan to Chicago to New York, and why? Because her newspaper, the fact that she even became the owner of a newspaper, is remarkable, right?
It's remarkable. One of the few women, period, to co-own a paper in a major city, which was Memphis.
And so Well, that goes terribly wrong because she makes, of course, the wrong people angry, meaning polite society. And she's sort of essentially her property seized, it's destroyed, and she stays up north.
Yes, she right. She becomes her issue is lynching. She becomes very concerned with it, and she does a lot of investigative reporting, and she reports what she sees. And she actually goes to this is investigative reporting. She goes to the scenes of lynching. She's interviewing people. She's writing what she calls the truth about lynching, which is not. This is not about rape at all. It's about power and keeping blacks down. These white women are not these asexual, pure people who are just ravished by these animalistic black men. In fact, she says it's a lot of consensual. There's a lot of consensual relationships that are going on. That is an issue, and she says really lynching is to keep blacks down. This is not this, clutch your pearls because the Southerners are being overrun by these animalistic black species. There's nothing like that at all. And so this gets people pretty angry.
And she calls out white men in the sense.
She calls
too.
out white men. Well, she says more. I mean, and excuse the light, but she says more black women have been raped by white men than what we call this new crime. What she's saying is the new crime of black men raping is a cover-up for all the things that are going in the South, because rape is the one thing that black people will excuse. Rape is the one thing that people will excuse with murder and mayhem as a response. Because it's such a horrible crime. And that's why they're using it. So she calls out this lie. She goes to Philadelphia to a conference that she was going to for a long time, but she had just written an editorial that says just what I've articulated.
Which is, people can't appreciate the dynamite that what
it was,
she said.
She says that white men aren't careful. I'm going to expose everything about
and
everybody.
That white women aren't as pure as you're making them seem.
And the white best men aren't pure because, character was destiny. Yeah. And so the best men, they thought if anybody was committing crimes, it was lower class black people and lower class white people. And she said, no, it's the leaders who do. So, there's so much stuff she's turning upside down. So anyway, she's in Philadelphia. She's on her way to New York to talk to the publisher, T. Thomas Fortune, who publishes one of the most important black newspapers in the country. And she arrives in New York, and T. Thomas Fortune meets her and says, have you heard what's happening down there in Memphis? She said, what are you talking about? Well, they have destroyed her paper. They've destroyed her printing press. They have her partners. They have run out of town. One partner, they put a pistol to his, to find out where she was, put a pistol to his head and pistol whipped him. The other one has run out of town. And everything is just lost. And so she says, well, if they're going to do that, I'm going to tell the whole truth about lynching. And so she writes in New York to this very important long editorial about lynching, and is there for a year or two, but then also and travels the country, but really likes Chicago. She goes to Chicago. And she really likes a guy in Chicago.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because she's, activist and writer. And she just leans into it. That's who she is. There's no accidental mantle of leadership in the sense of her work.
Right.
But her personal life, she's in her 30s, her mid 30s.
That's right.
When she meets this attorney. He's an attorney.
That's right.
And writer and activist.
And who turns out to be just as radical as she is, but he's an assistant state's attorney in Chicago, which is, of course, a governor appointment, gubernatorial appointment. And so, And he has been married before. He has a child, and they fall in love when Ida is traveling all around the country with her anti-lynching campaign. She says that there's every place she goes, there's a love letter waiting for her that he has written to, and then Bill, I said, boy, I was glad to be able to write about a happy marriage. Lord have mercy, But they were real partners, and he was very supportive of her from the very beginning.
Did she have a conflict within herself because they would have 4 children, and so again we're in the Edwardian, let's say the late Victorian, now Edwardian era. There are expectations about who is to care for the children, and how is she to balance her activism.
She's tortured by this, and because also this is a period when there's new ideas about even childhood. For a long time, children were just little adults. They just treat them. But now childhood is a category unto itself. And there's certain ways you're supposed to, mothers particularly are supposed to handle children. You can't leave the house. This is their formative period. You have to stay at home with them. This is when all their moral fiber, everything is developing. And so there's lots of pressure for women who have children to stay at home. But Ida's such an activist, she's really struggling. She even tries to retire at one point. After she has her second child, she tries to retire. But she just can't do it. But what she decides to do is, when she goes to Chicago, she's asked by the Republican Women's Committee to help them in the campaign for William McKinley. And Ida likes McKinley. McKinley had a lot of, when he was governor of Ohio, he was really an anti-lynching guy, and talked a lot about how negative lynching was. So she liked him, even though he had other, but for that. So she campaigns for McKinley with the Women's Republican Committee. And they have an itinerary going all across the state of Illinois. And they ask her, and she says, well, I'll go, but you have to provide a nurse for me at every stop. Because she had a nursing baby. And so they said they would do it. And that's what she decided to do is, she said, I'll continue my activism. I'll just take the children with me. Mm-hmm. And she does that even in anti-lynching stuff. She will go to, when she goes to the site of a lynching to report on, she'll take the kids. Right. So this is how somehow she tries to resolve it. It's never completely resolved, but she does resolve it by this way of not leaving the children, but taking them with her.
Well, speaking of unresolved, what about her relations with other Black leaders and activists? Because, we are in the period of foundation of the NAACP, and she organized too, and was part of various organizations, women's, the Organization of Black Women as well. So how is she fitting into the structure of organizations, which don't exactly always lend themselves to radicals?
Not to her. Yeah, to radicals, and radical in this sense. What she had figured out was that the way to really for racial progress was not this kind of idea of negotiation of the elites, but really, for example, at one point she says, look, the South depends on Northern investment and Black labor. She says, if Black labor, has like a strike and refuses to work, she says, we're going to solve a lot of issues like lynching, right? So she's for this insurgency of the laboring classes. This is so different from the NAACP, et cetera, because we're still in this age of people, and we still have it now to some extent, even though I might call it something else, of if they're going to go, if the NAACP is going to support somebody and put their resources behind them, they have to be like respectable people. They can't have had some kinds of other criminal issues or whatever. And so they really handpicked the people and the causes that they would support. And she didn't believe that. Mm-hmm. She didn't believe in that. So she would actually sometimes compete with the NAACP when there was a big issue somewhere. And she would rally around the communities. It's sort of like Ella Baker versus Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. She said, this doesn't come from the top, it has to come from the communities. But there are all kinds of people in these communities. She didn't care. That wasn't the issue. The people at the top said, oh, no, we can't have her. He can't have him. He's so. So they would compete for funds and money and all of that also in these issues. So they were really very, very different. And she was a transgressive woman. Mm-hmm. People like W.E.B. Du Bois had many virtues, but transgressive women liking them wasn't one of them.
Who himself was not the easiest person to deal with.
He was very difficult. But people don't call him difficult. They always call women difficult.
Women are difficult.
But they don't call. But he was very difficult as well.
But this idea of gender within the civil rights movement, I mean that continues on into the 60s.
It continues in the
But if we think of this like classic civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the whole notion of how women were engaged or relegated, or what role they had in support versus leadership. And she's challenging that.
She's challenging
60 years before the question that historians really haven't even addressed adequately to this day.
I think she's the first. I would guess she's the first Black woman who is trying to actually make a living as a race woman. Mm-hmm. She wants to make a living as an activist. And she wants to represent, they have a whole lot of ideas around representation. She wants to represent the race. But women can't represent the race. Are you kidding me? It's got to be a guy. It's got to be Fred Douglass or Du Bois or Booker or whatever.
And what woman even could it be, right? Is it, which kind of woman?
That's right. The true womanhood idea, virtuous and reticent, and she was not reticent at all. And her also remember with her relationship with Du Bois. Ida's older than Du Bois. She starts her campaign in 1892. Du Bois is still in Europe. He's not a part of this activist scene at all. So he finally comes back. He comes back to the U.S. and wants to gets involved with things. And she says, "Oh, nice little guy here," And Du Bois.
Was it's prickly.
He's very, very prickly. That's the right word. And at one time, she was a part of an organization. She said, "Well, let's let him come and do a little paper on Black business. He's just from Europe. Let's help him out." And that was kind of her attitude. And this did not work with Du Bois well.
No. Well, how do we get then? Because she's only 61, 62 when she dies. Although
68 when she dies.
Oh, 68. Sorry.
Yeah.
By that point in her life, in the 20s, say, is she still a sort of radical outsider, or has she begun to be embraced as a figure who was maybe transformative, or are people just not willing to speak about it in those ways?
Well, in Chicago, she is so active in everything. Mm-hmm. She's not traveling across the country.
And that's an important point to note, that she traveled internationally as well.
That's right.
And lectured and all over the country. She was a name that people would see in the press.
From New York to California, twice to the British Isles. And in fact, she gets so much support by her second trip to the British Isles. This is when people really begin to pay attention to her anti-lynching campaign, because the British are on her side. And the British are seen as, in many ways as superior to the U.S. in terms of intellect, et cetera, et cetera. And when their people begin to support, the Archbishop of Canterbury signs on to her campaign. A number of other members of royalty, as well as important activists, sign on to her campaign by her second trip. Then, boy, when she comes back to New York, there's just a big scene. Every reporter in New York is there, to talk to her, and then she'll go from New York to California. So she's quite. This is really. She's quite a significant a figure at this point.
When she dies, it was unexpected, or had she
No,
been
she
ill?
was ill.
Mm-hmm.
She had kidney problems.
Was the reaction of one of great honor?
Yes.
So
Yes.
It's interesting. Talk a little about that. I'm always fascinated.
Yes.
At people who are the problems when they're alive,
Right.
but after they've died, suddenly they're heroes. What was that like? How did that transition occur? How could her image once again be used to people's benefit?
Yes. Well, in Chicago, one thing in Chicago, she gets involved in politics.
Mm-hmm.
Chicago is completely.
All Chicago is politics.
Tell me about it. When you go to Chicago, you get in a cab. The cab driver knows everything that's going on. Politics. But she helps a lot of people. First of all, she has, she starts the first Black kindergarten. I said only Ida would be anti-lynching today and a kindergarten tomorrow. The first Black kindergarten in Chicago was Ida Wells. She has something called the Negro Fellowship League, which is like a settlement house where migrants coming, this is a period of the Great Migration coming from the South, and a lot of people coming to Chicago, where she houses them and creates a reading room and all that kind of thing. She's involved in politics and brings a lot of people along, and starts the first Black women's suffrage organization in the country, and promotes not just Black women but white women as well for positions. She really is one of the first. She becomes a parole officer. She's very concerned with people who are jailed and in prison unjustly, and she and her husband work a lot with that. So people know her, and when things happen, big floods in Mississippi in 1927, and a lot of the refugees come to Chicago, and they knock on Ida's door, right? The big riots, the 1919, which is one of the largest racial riots that happened in the country. She goes around taking affidavits of.
And she's on the government's radar by then, the federal government's radar.
That's right. She? Yes. The federal by the World War I years, she is. Woodrow Wilson years. Woodrow Wilson establishes the first modern kind of surveillance entity in the U.S. And it's around World War I. And so there's military intelligence, and they are following lots of people, but they're following Ida and Marcus Garvey, who's in Chicago at that time.
Because she will work with anyone, won't she? To move it forward.
Garvey is the same thing, grassroots, Black pride, that kind of thing. Yeah. She said, that those boats were a problem. That was a whole nother. But because he was going to Africa, right? But she liked Garvey.
Well, he wasn't. He was again. He was going to move something along, was the idea, and not going to wait for permission, or even within his own communities.
He was a Black nationalist, and yes.
Not accommodating always, not this notion of accommodationism,
right?
Which certainly Eleanor Roosevelt.
And she was. This becomes a period by the 20th century, becomes a period when other people are really creating Black leaders. Mm-hmm. when people, they may not have had to be actually liked by influential whites, but they had to be accepted in a certain kind of way, and she didn't think that was good. But so somebody like Marcus Garvey is completely different, of course, than that, and so she likes she likes that, and there's just a great. I went into a lot of files, the archives, and and I found some of those files on her, and one of them, my favorite, is that she said Ida Wells is a dangerous agitator, dangerous race agitator, and so is Marcus Garvey, but Ida is more dangerous than Garvey. And I just love that. So yeah, so now she's on, and people are a little afraid of her. After the Espionage Act is where you can go to prison for going against the government. She does things that in fact, she's visited by intelligence people who tell her she has to stop. There's a whole story of what she's doing, and she wants to protest in the black churches and gather people, and the black churches won't let her come in because they're fearful. So that's another, so she has problems.
Let's see if there's any questions from the audience. Where's Cliff? There Cliff comes. He'll have the microphone because, we could just sit here and
I know, and especially me because I just talk and talk.
I think people talk a lot about intersectionalism sometimes.
Yeah.
And if there ever were an example of where race and gender and class,
that's right,
and within communities, not just this great big umbrella of intersectionalism, but within communities,
absolutely,
it is evident so
she's
clearly.
And why would she be?
Why would she be afraid of the U.S. government when she's done investigative journalism about lynching in the Deep South?
Right.
So bring it on, U.S. government. Any questions? Questions? So yeah, there's just almost too much. That's the thing. That's almost like, how do you write a short book on? How did you do one volume?
Obviously, I don't know how to.
Did any of her siblings and children follow in her footsteps?
Not really. Her daughter, her youngest daughter, Alfreda, who is the closest. Ida had her when she was 42 years old. And Alfreda was the one sort of that got away. You could imagine Ida was a pretty strict parent. And she wanted Alfreda to be a lawyer. And Alfreda did work in her father's office. Her father was a lawyer. But she decided she didn't want to be that kind of activist Ida was. It was very painful, She said she would see her mother come home just so upset and so frustrated, and that's not what she wanted. She wanted to get married and have children, which she did, but becomes a very important civic leader in Chicago. Does finish. She finishes the University of Chicago at the age of 16, and it's her children who I know.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask her. Last child died in 1988, right? Or
sorry,
her child, her last living child, died in 1988.
Yes.
So
that's
they
right.
lived to see.
That's right.
This.
That's right.
Recognition.
I actually just a quick story. I was actually in touch with Alfreda, her daughter, when I was writing. And this is sort of something after I'll talk about following footsteps in a different way. Alfreda promised to. I was trying to get a foundation grant. Alfreda said that she would write on my behalf for that grant, and I thanked her a lot. She didn't know me very well, but she'd seen my other work and liked it. And so when it came time for like a week before the letter was due, I said, let me call her and make sure everything's okay if she has any questions. I call, and one of her sons answers, and he says, "I'm so sorry." He says, "But Alfreda's had a stroke, and she's in the hospital." And I was just I'd hadn't gotten into a relationship with her. It was very upsetting to me to think that she was probably getting ready to die. That's how he sounded. 3 days later, I get a phone call, and it's Alfreda. She says, "Now you know I had this stroke." She said, "But I just want to tell you, I'm going to get your letter on time. I got my son to come with a typewriter in the hospital to type it up." So in some ways, you could say maybe she wasn't doing anti-lynching work, but it was that kind of, that's what I thought. I said, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
She's going to get it done.
She's going to get it. She's going to get it done. Yeah. But the other kids weren't as, one of them became a lawyer. I don't think a particularly effective one. Another one never sort of was able to, he was a chauffeur for a while and did some things. And the lawyer got in some trouble with funds. And I think she must have been very, one child, another daughter, had learning disability problems. So I think she was probably, knowing Ida, pretty disappointed in her children. She fell out with Alfreda for a long time as well, when Alfreda went and got married, and they didn't speak for a long time. But it's Alfreda Duster who, after her mother Ida dies, is the one that takes up the autobiography, edits it, and gets it published. So it's an interesting sort of family chronicle. And just yesterday I was now the grandchildren are also on lecture circuits talking about Ida, et cetera. And I was just on the stage with her grandson yesterday, and I always love seeing them.
It is a fascinating. We see it certainly with the Roosevelts, who were such commanding personalities, both of them ultimately in their work in very different ways, but at the same time, how as children you navigate that themselves, and you can when parents are, because both it's all encompassing, isn't it? It's working, and it's more than them, and it's beyond some notions of.
They don't like sharing their parents with the public, and they get resentful, and
it's complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and I'm sure it was a tough.
Well, if she was that tough on herself,
she was demanding on herself. That's right. So.
Well, if no more questions, I would, because there's like 6 other programs I think I want to do with you now. I can, after just this conversation, I can think of the topic. Hold on, I'm sorry, but I'll have to have you back.
Great.
But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Join us out in the lobby if you would, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.